Welcome, everyone, to the Fractional Source Podcast. We're here today with our good friend Joe Goodwin and James Mitchell and I, and we are excited to be talking about good innovation going on in government today and a bit around cybersecurity and other important key topics that are quite prescient, and just want to go ahead and have a terrific conversation. So thank you for joining, and Joe, good to see you again.
Thanks. Great to see you, TJ.
So to kick this off, one of the things is there's so much going on in government today, a lot of changes, a lot of machinations. I think one of the things that we find at Fractional Source is a lot of fun to talk about is how do we help, local agencies, city, county, special service districts, and bring to them the capabilities that sometimes, especially the small jurisdictions, just can't afford. And how can we do things that are incremental and make a difference? And so with that said, just talk a little bit about some of your ideas there on the cyber front and on some of the exercise front. What kinds of things are interesting to you right now?
So with respect to the environment we're in now, especially where, a couple things, and it's always been this way where we need to make the most out of the resources that we have. We don't have all the time, money, resources in the world to be prepared for all hazards. And especially now where there's seemingly a shift where there's more responsibility on the state and locals, tribes and territories to be able to manage that on our own. So I think one of the most important concepts that we need to continue to push forward and help our state and locals with and tribes and territories is this idea of understanding and managing preparedness. So, we talk a lot about risk management, which is important. But to me, the conversation should be more around preparedness, which there's a bit of a distinction there. Preparedness isn't just about predicting what the next crisis is going to be. It's about making sure that our capabilities align with our risks. So that's the key part of preparedness, is understanding both risk and capabilities, whether we're talking cyber security threats, hurricanes, active shooter situations, across the board.
And it's not an old term. Preparedness has been around.
No, it's not.
It's in the doctrine for 20 plus years now. That's where I started my career in Homeland Security, was around the concept of preparedness. So, and the question that always came up was, well, how prepared are you, right? That measurement of preparedness. So you want to talk a little bit about how you can measure that?
Yeah, I love that question. So I worked for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in their Homeland Security office years ago. And, I'd have to go out and give talks or talking to fellow govies there at state. And I like to use the question, because at the time, Homeland Security was relatively new. This is 2004 through 2006 timeframe. And a lot of people didn't know exactly what we did. And I said, well, think of it this way. We want to answer the question, how well prepared are we to deal with bad stuff happening against us? There's that word preparedness again, right? It's not identifying our risks. It's not, we're just here to build a capability. You need to understand that. So I kind of feel like the term preparedness has faded a bit, right, over the years, or has been replaced with other words that kind of mean the same thing. But perhaps I'm a purist. I'm old school. I like the term preparedness. But we talk in terms of resiliency now, right?
Yeah.
Similar, sort of. But in terms of breaking down this idea of determining our preparedness, we can ask that question, how well prepared are we to deal with bad things happening against us? You can break down that question into an actual quantitative analytic process. And I can't help myself. I studied systems engineering in college. I think like an engineer, and I like breaking things down like that into doable chunks, right? How to actually tackle that problem. So sure, we can answer that question very qualitatively and be like, we're pretty good. We're pretty well prepared, right? It's not a great answer, okay, great. Well, what backs that up? But if you take a quantitative approach and analytic approach and break that down, you can look at, how well prepared, well is a function of assessing yourself in some way. How well prepared are we as our jurisdiction or our organization or our county or our company, whatever it might be, or enterprise. How well prepared are we to dealing with are the capabilities. And those can be, in terms of government, federal government, we can think of things like FEMA's 32 core capabilities. Those are things that we should be able to do to deal with bad things happening. Or they may be a list of cybersecurity controls, right, to deal with cyber challenges. And then dealing with the bad things. Those are the bad things happening. Obviously,
Right.
the intentional and unintentional threats that we face. And if we break it down that way, that starts to kind of open up a process, right? A methodology which is justifiable that we can all use to say, if we only have X amount of money to spend this year via a grant, via internal budget that we have set aside, then we know we are making the most efficient use of those funds in being prepared. And again, we're aligning the capabilities we're building to the risks that we see are most relevant to us.
I think one of the unique things, and having worked in local government at the city, county, and state level, I think that the unique thing is we try to boil the ocean too often, right? And so there's a bit of risk benefit that's needed, and we have these really high consequence events that are very low risk of happening, right? So think of catastrophic nuclear incidents, right? Very high consequence, very low likelihood of happening in a certain period of time. And at the same point, it doesn't mean you can't plan for and practice for them, but you have to kind of focus on the things that are likely to happen. So I think in the cyber world, like the most likely thing we have that is going to happen is people are our weakest link in the cyber chain of security. And so we obviously need to train our people not to do dumb cyber things, right? And so, how do we balance the focus of where we spend our time and energy, both from a technology and a resource perspective, on the things most likely to happen versus the things that are high consequence? That's a unique balance.
Yeah, great question. And that's where the kind of the math comes in a little bit, or that quantitative. So when we shift from just asking that basic question, how well prepared are we? So let's pick on cyber from a cyber perspective. That's one thing. That's highly qualitative. You're getting opinions. It's Kentucky windage, right? Which way do we think the wind is blowing? Shifting to saying, okay, well, no, let's break down this problem set. Let's look at our enterprise and all the assets within our enterprise and all the systems. Let's inventory those so we know what could be affected that we care about, number one. Secondly, what are all the threats that are viable against our system and enterprise? So this is, we get into the specifics around what types of APTs are out there, or, types of ransomware attacks. And the bottom line is we all know what sorts of attacks are out there from a cybersecurity perspective. But low-hanging fruit are things like ransomware, phishing, DDoS. They all have different ways to get in, and they all have different impacts. But the idea is, let's inventory what those threats are, and then let's match. Okay, and by the way, this can be done in the physical world too. Let's match. Let's go through all the combinations of the threats, the bad things that could happen, and let's pair them with all of our assets and systems to see, okay, which of these scenarios, which is really what we're creating. We're creating a kind of a menu of scenarios, potential bad days. And then given those scenarios, let's take a step back and let's look at the likelihood of that threat actually happening. So there you're looking and working with law enforcement, working with industry expertise on cyber. What are we seeing out there currently based on our type of sector that we live in, whether it's healthcare, K-12? How likely is that vector going to hit us? Again, based on intel or partnerships with folks who are in the know. So that's the one thing, is that how likely is that to happen to us, that threat? Secondly is, how vulnerable are we to that actually happening? So many times people pair T and V together, threat and vulnerability, and they call that likelihood. What's the likelihood of it happening, or of a likelihood of an actual impact? You can put those together into one likelihood term. You can divide them up. I like to divide them up because after you're done the analysis, you can dive back in to kind of peel back the layers of the onion to do that autopsy. But how vulnerable are we? If there's a ransomware attack against our billing system at the hospital or in the city, do we have countermeasures in place? Do we have the security effectiveness in place to counter something like that? And that can only be determined through assessment, which we'll get to in a minute. And then lastly, there's consequence or impact. again, risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So if that scenario comes to fruition, there's an intent and capability to carry out the attack. So there's likelihood. We are vulnerable to that attack type. It's coming through, right? It's coming through the walls. Then what's the impact? And that's where, you have these, extremes where, sure, the consequence of a massive meteor impact here in the United States is pretty big. But what are the chances of it happening? Extraordinarily small. There's like a mathematical trade-off there, right? And you can see it when you actually do the assessment and you're scoring these things. And again, when we talk scoring, sometimes people say, well, how do you put a number on, a vulnerability or a consequence? Well, it's a balance. It's a balance between that qualitative and quantitative, and you need to start somewhere, right? And you can say, okay, I'm going to assess something as high, medium, or low, or I'm going to score it on a scale from 1 to 10. Some of that might just be opinion, and some of it might be, well, we're going to rate it as a very high if it's greater than, 10,000 casualties or greater than $50 million economic impact. You can start to kind of align those things. So, yeah, so if you understand and you go through the process of assessing the likelihood and the impact, you can start to see the numbers shake out. And what it does, are those numbers absolutes? No. But what they absolutely do, no pun intended, is they point you in the right direction of how are we going to start to triage our risks? Where are our risks? So with that, then coupled with that same process on the capability side. So just like I said, we have to inventory and understand what are all the threats and hazards we could potentially face. What are all of our assets and systems that we care about that can be impacted? We also want to inventory what are the arrows on our quiver? What are the capabilities that we can bring to bear to mitigate all these things that could potentially happen? And when you have that list, you then assess how good you are at them. And again, that can be broken down into one way I like to look at capabilities is looking at the 5 elements of capability. Do you have a plan in place? Do you have the organization in place? Do you have the equipment? Have you trained and have you exercised that capability? And that can be an indication, kind of looking at a capability that way. Are we green, yellow, or red on that capability? Are we really good at it or we're really bad? Or if we're bad, do we have an MOU with our neighbor and they can come in and help us, which we see many times. So, so that in terms of a very long-winded answer to your question, TJ, but in terms of understanding, some things are more likely than others. Some things are more impactful than others. Let's analyze all of it. Let's go through that process. And again, what that also does is, in the end, it allows you to then justify your investments to your senior leadership, to your elected officials, to your chiefs in understanding. And if they ask questions and say, I see that, but explain to me, or it doesn't make sense. Well, let me just understand it. We ran through we've done an assessment. Here are our professional opinions as to why we're rating things the way they are. Then, okay, there's still disagreement. That's where you have other conversations around subjectivity. There will always be political nuances, right, that have to be taken into account. So that's how you kind of tackle that dilemma.
The number of organizations that don't do this, like a systemic approach, it's a little bit frightening. But that every high-performing organization, whether it's in the private and public sector, they have a systemic approach to planning or systematic approach to planning,
Mm-hmm.
because they have to remove the emotional bias associated with the decision itself, right? So that quantitative approach you're talking about is incredibly time-intensive. It requires a lot of different people, right, across the organization and subject matter experts to essentially pause what they're doing and roll that into their workflow or make it part of their annual planning process, which is a really hard turn for most public sector organizations. Most private sector organizations will do it in reaction to realization of risk, right? Some sort of financial risk or impact. And it's usually a macro event in the market where they say, okay, we have to prepare and plan for whatever that, they always plan to a black swan or something that's going to be so far out because you catch so many other kinds of incidents on the way to that potentially never going to happen scenario, right? But you get
Mhm.
a lot of benefit out of that all hazards approach. The second piece is that because it's time intensive and resource intensive, you tend to, as a leader, devalue the process, right? Like I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to pull my people to do this. I think that's a huge myth, and it's one that we're trying to solve at Fractional Source. We think that you can actually, like, my current theory is that if you brought someone in to do this, you're going to be addicted pretty quickly to that process because the things you find out are pretty incredible. The math is important,
Yeah.
but the interaction with the math after the fact and the decision making process and what to do next is probably the most valuable thing you'll get out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think this is something that is perfectly cut out for something like us, like Fractional Source, where you can bring in that expertise. You're not bringing in FTEs to run programs like this. This is something that doesn't need to happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So coming in with that expertise to be able to guide through this process is something that a fractional asset is perfect for. Now you talk about, so a couple things about the process, and yeah, so the process I describe in, doing the assessments and, building the spreadsheets and inventorying assets and threats. That can be scaled many different ways. It just depends on the appetite of the organization for how much they want to commit to the process. And you hit the nail on the head, James. Some organizations are like, you know what, I don't have time for it. So I want to offload it to somebody else, or one of my own people can do it, but they only have a certain amount of time to. So you could do this whole process in a matter of days. You could do it over the course of, a couple months. Depends on how deep you want to go in the analysis. So it's easy to show how it can scale. But regardless, and I remember doing some of these risk analyses for states and cities, and we would come in, and these would be kind of short, and over the matter of a day, we'd ask everybody, knowing how valuable everybody's time is, listen, we promise we're only going to use up, we do want you for 6 hours, and we need all of you for 6 hours, but then we'll leave you alone. And in that room, we would have a mix of law enforcement, fire, EMS, public utilities. And again, these are for states or cities, folks from the governor's office or the mayor's office, folks from the hospital networks. And, we'd have however many people in a room. We'd be going through the process of talking about we'd have the asset catalog. We would talk about threats and hazards. We would talk about the impacts of certain things. And the greatest takeaway from those workshops was, and this would happen all the time. We would be talking about a certain subsector or an asset within the jurisdiction. And somebody would be describing the economic impact if that asset were to go away, or would be talking about certain vulnerability types. And somebody else in the room would say, I had no idea that asset was even in our county, more or less the national security impact it has on the computer industry, like something random. And they would say, yeah, we try and keep that quiet. That's part of our countermeasures. But yeah, it's really important. And, the other person scratches their head, and then after the meeting, they're exchanging business cards, and they're like, it's somebody from law enforcement saying, I had no idea. Hey, can we meet next week? And maybe we could put together a plan and help you guys with, now knowing what you're doing. And again, that's kind of an exaggerated example, but the idea is building those relationships with the other people in the room who all have vested interest in whatever that is extraordinarily impactful and powerful. So when you're having a structured process like this and methodology, whether it be an assessment, an exercise, which by the way, I would also say exercises are awesome venues in which to do that. Having a tabletop exercise on a cyber disruption, let's say. I've been a part of some of those. Those are equally as eye-opening for the participants because they're meeting people they've never met before who work in their same town, county, organization. And when you do like a cyber disruption workshop where, you've identified a couple specific cybersecurity threats, let's say, against important systems in their jurisdiction, and you sit down and it's a typical kind of process where you're like, okay, we start the day, everybody comes to work, you sit down at your desk, boom, first thing happens that you're like, this isn't good. You see something on your computer, maybe it's ransomware, maybe you're getting calls from somebody else that something weird is going on in your system. And then it just gets worse and worse. The idea there is, in a tabletop exercise kind of a format, is to understand with your neighbor, well, what are you doing in that situation? Like, I think I know what I'm doing, but what are you doing? And oh, by the way, the answer isn't, I'm going to call my IT guy. That's not, we disallow those in these scenarios because they're working the issue. The problem is you've got a continuity of operations issue in front of you. And depending on what systems have been impacted, you need to still fulfill your mission, whatever that mission is. So how do you do that in a way where you're not reliant upon just passing the buck to IT because it's a cyber issue, therefore they're dealing with it? No, cyber is an issue for all of us now, every single one of us. So we all have to know how to deal with it ourselves and not rely on others. They're the experts in I like to say, just reconnecting the wires, so to speak. But from an operations standpoint, we need to work hand in hand with them and our colleagues to power through whatever the issue is until we're back up and running.
Two things you hit on there, I think, Joe. One, the first one is super important, and it's the relationships. Just like humans are part of the problem in cyber, they're also the answer, right? So relationships, knowing what capabilities people have in your organization or nearby organizations, knowing how to resolve problems, knowing there's capabilities that you didn't realize were there before. I think that's a huge part of tabletops and coordination, communication. It only happens when you get people in the same room together, to work on that. So huge. The second piece, though, I think is important. I think a lot of people think of these as like big, massive projects, and we overplay that too much. And I think instead, it's like, what's the minimum we can do to do better? And so, as an example, when we have a fractional CTO or CIO, oftentimes they're 10%, 20% of their time, right? So that's 4 hours a week, 8 hours a week, not a ton of time. But I think of the small communities and organizations we've already started to help and the ones that we can help in the future, that, 4 hours a week of somebody focusing on cyber is a huge improvement from 0 hours a week, right? Or other duties as assigned where it's not their core focus. And if somebody were to come in and let's just say they spend 4 to 8 hours a week doing nothing but looking at, IT security, new software, new capabilities, good practices, good training, and then organized to set up a once a year, twice a year exercise or event to ensure that they're prepared, you will probably be 90% better off than most of your peers just by doing those two things.
Oh yeah. Yep. Absolutely. There's like a resilience dividend there for a little amount of time put into this. Yeah. There's an extraordinary amount of dividend you're getting in not only reducing risk, but speeding your recovery because you have the relationships in place and you're a step ahead, and building public trust, which is the other thing, that's extraordinarily important.
I would also argue that going back to the time issue, and I hear this a lot, like we just don't have time to do these sorts of exercises, and specifically tabletop exercises, because it is a time-intensive, focus-intensive event. Everyone who does it, you have to make time and be deliberate about it, number one. And the best place to learn that you either lack capability, or to your example, Joe, that you do something that maybe your community of practitioners don't fully understand or appreciate that you do already, and haven't represented that in their workflow. The worst time to find all that stuff out is during an actual incident. So it may seem obvious. We should probably say it out loud, though. The reason you do this is because there is no pressure, real-time pressure applied to this. It's all essentially fiction in the room, and it's actually fun. If you've been part of an exercise, it's fun to kick the tires on all of your policies and plans and see how they actually go into place, because otherwise it's just shelfware until something bad happens. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't pulled it off the shelf, then it's just a layer of dust you got to blow through before you can actually hope to God that you're doing the right thing, and that all the people that you have listed in this plan have read the plan. They haven't, right? Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. Like, they have to exercise the plan. So it does come down to people. TJ, I think you're right there. Obviously, I make people accountable all the time, because if we rely just on systems, then and IT and whatever. It's just things are going to fall apart. The other thing is that the irony here is the folks who should be doing this and standing up and investing in an exercise format are typically not the people that are thrust into an incident and don't have the excuse of an op tempo that says, I don't have time to focus on this. I'm talking about, you listed to K through 12 and healthcare. I'd put public safety up there. Those folks are typically on the right side of an investment from someone in the budget office or a city manager or mayor who has said this is a priority. Every time leadership says it's not a priority, then it doesn't get done, right? But if you make the investment up front and you say, once a year, we're going to run this exercise, cross-community exercise, to see where the leaks are, right? Let's fill the bucket with water and see where the leaks are. If they don't say that, it's not going to happen, right? So I don't. Well, we say people might be an issue here. It's not the people doing the actual work of a plan or the what I would call the output of an exercise. It's the leadership at the top who has said that this is not a priority and we're not going to invest in it, which is unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. It's again, and it goes without saying. We'll say it anyway that the most senior leadership has to be a part of the process and has to endorse it and show interest and have that buy-in. Because otherwise it's not going to be as effective. I remember one time doing a day-long workshop on kind of the risk analysis stuff in a given state. I won't say the state, but the moral of the story is it was coincidentally, there happened to be their U.S. senator was walking through the facility that day. They were there for some other reason, and they were getting a tour. And the group kind of popped their head in, and by the way, we got zero heads up that they were popping their head in, so it was kind of jarring to see the senator there. But they're like, oh, she's here for XYZ, and we're just showing the facility. What are y'all doing? And we talked about what we were doing briefly, and she came in and sat down. She's like, oh my God, this is really interesting. And they sat down and listened for a while, and it clearly was not, she was being very sincere because it was clearly not on. In fact, I think the people she was with were annoyed that she wanted to go off script, right, and sit down and hear what we were doing. But she cared. It was her state. We were doing an analysis. It's for an important reason. And I think that the public safety leaders in that state really appreciated that because they're like, that's nice. We've got, our U.S. senator is taking sincere interest in what we're doing, so much so that she wanted to sit down and listen in on what we're doing. And that's really important.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we just have to make those practical and easier. And I think one is, investing a small slice of time and investment into a fractional CTO, CIO, CISO, other leader who's going to just focus on this every week of the year. Might only be 4 hours a week, but every week of the year, somebody is focused on this in the big picture. And that allows them monthly, quarterly, yearly to make progress, right? Even if that progress is 1% better preparation, 1% better process-wise, 1% better in communications and relationships, the things we just talked about. And so I think step A is, getting that very, slice of a fractional leader in there to ensure that it's not being ignored, which is often happening because it's too big of a job for somebody to do who doesn't know what they're doing, i.e. the background in it. And it's also too scary investment-wise to necessarily hire a full-time person to do nothing but this all the time in a medium to smaller organization. That's just not affordable. And then I think the same thing is you need somebody, if they're going to plan these events, whether it's exercises, tabletops, other things, there's a lot of lead up, there's a lot of follow up, there's a lot of follow through that needs to happen. And if that's just given to a staffer as other duties as assigned, it often just doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah, it's, again, back to that, there's a dividend here in resilience and preparedness where you're right. And you both said it. It's not, some people aren't devoting anything at all to this, or if they do, it's reactionary because they have to fulfill a grant requirement. So you're way ahead of the game, even providing that slice of a fractional effort towards this. And it's really giving you a lot. And it's also not, it's not super sexy either, right? So to bring in an expert to do this is important. There was even a Seinfeld episode about risk. If you all remember George trying to study to become a risk manager, and it's mind-numbingly boring. Yeah, risk can be a little boring, but it's extraordinarily important. And again, it gives you that dividend. Even a little bit invested will take you a very long way in understanding your overall preparedness environment.
Honestly, the best pitch for an exercise internal to any organization. I think Joe, you called it like a bad day, sort of like a view of continuity of operations is actually, hey, financial decision maker, whether you're a budget officer, CFO, don't you want to test these investments you've made over the past year, 2, 3 years? Like, don't you want to see where that money went and what you're getting in the worst possible situation of this organization we're going to face? Here's your dollars and cents at work. And I know, by the way, the selling point here is that if it doesn't work, we either have to invest more or we didn't invest in the right thing, and we have to recalculate, recalibrate. And that's a starting point for most organizations, is the financial piece, right? And then extrapolating that initial investment in the budget process all the way to an outcome is really hard to do without actually physically going through the motions of seeing where those dollars went, what the impact is on a bad day. Because blue sky is great. Every day we go to work and everything's fine. And yeah, I'm glad I made that investment that has nothing to do with everything working the way it's supposed to, right? The investment is there to make sure that when things go poorly, things continue to work the way they're supposed to, or we have a reaction that is accretive to the organization's outcome, right? We're going to keep the ship steady. We're going to have positive outcomes. We're going to learn from them. We're going to get together and talk about it. That's the other thing I want to kind of touch on, which is this idea that exercises that don't happen in a vacuum. Incident planning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can't happen in a vacuum, right? It has to have multiple inputs. And so the best organizations I've worked with have spent a lot of time planning for exercises, as TJ, I think, used the term other duties as assigned. But in my days at FEMA, we were COOP officers, continuity of operations officers. You had a role, and you had a group, an ecosystem of folks that you worked with who were also COOP officers. And that was a day of your week. Every Thursday or Friday, you'd have a series of meetings to do that planning, and that was part of your job, and it was assigned to you as your job. It's a very deliberate motion that something like the federal government can afford. How do we make room for that in a small or medium-sized government organization, right? Does it get the attention that it should if we have that same kind of model? Or are we talking about an actual public safety role? Or are we talking about a policy role? Like, Joe, what's your opinion on who should have that hat amongst many other hats?
It's a good question. I think it should be driven by policy, purely because you need the attention of the decision makers at a high level. So if they're driving these processes and are leading those efforts, I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck there. Now, the implementation is going to be most likely public safety leadership, or those involved, but you need to have that senior executive in the room, because it then becomes routine, right? The planning does, right? Or the continuity, like what you talked about. It's like, this is what we do. And it also signals how important senior leadership thinks that this needs to be. So if it becomes part of the fabric of the organization on a regular basis, whatever they define as regular, and it's not just a public safety thing. It's like back to cyber, right? If you start to have a really bad day with your information technology infrastructure or your connected devices, whatever it may be, it is not an IT problem. It is everybody's problem. It's the same thing with all hazards preparedness, with planning, continuity of operations. Everybody needs to be invested in it. Sure, you've got specialists on the cyber side, InfoSec folks, IT folks who can really dive into that, right? On the physical security side, you have folks who can really dive into mitigation and understanding that. But preparedness is everybody's responsibility. Therefore, senior executive leadership really needs to be the ones cracking that whip.
Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to stop. I think we have definitely put some good food for thought into the ears, hopefully, of city managers, county managers, other department heads across the city, county, special districts, state, and local environment. And something that we can all make incremental progress towards, for an affordable amount of investment that we can't necessarily, afford not to make anymore just with the kinds of threats that we deal with every day. So, Joe, I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on with James and I today and talk about such an important topic. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Always great to talk to you.
Thanks, Joe.
See you.